I spent $3,000 building my dream PC rig. Putting the RTX 4080 in here has made this machine powerful enough to run any game in ultrawide at 120 FPS. No doubt, this thing is an absolute monster and pretty overkill honestly. Despite the shitty launch, I was super excited to build my rig with this card, and I've been super happy with the performance. That said, there are two issues worth bringing up. Number one obviously is the price, but two is that trying to use this in a small form factor case has been a fucking nightmare. I went with the Gigabyte Eagle OC variant, which was what I managed to order on release day. The design has really grown on me, and the gray complements my white case quite well. Aside from the different cooler design, there is a slight factory overclock differentiating it from the Founders Edition. It's 2520 MHz compared to 2505, which in real use doesn't really translate to much of an FPS improvement at all. It retails at $1239, which is $40 over the MSRP, which compared to some of the other board partners isn't too bad. Having been dead set on getting the 80 level card this generation, I kinda just stomached the cost, knowing this is a proper 4K and ultra-wide GPU. This card is a chunky boy weighing in at over 4 pounds and is so big that it just barely fits in my case. It measures in at 342mm long, 150mm wide, and 60mm tall. It's literally so long that you have to install this anti-sag bracket to not damage the card or your motherboard. It perfectly fits in the 011 Dynamic Mini, big asterisk without a cable. This is on the larger end of small form factor cases using an ATX motherboard, but still opting for a SFX power supply to reduce space. Before even thinking about buying one of these, you're definitely going to want to go and take measurements of your case, especially if it's any smaller than mine. If you don't have at least a couple inches of clearance between the GPU and side panel, you're definitely going to want to grab this cable mod adapter. With such a beefy design, you do get quite a massive cooler despite the relatively low 320 watt power usage of the card. Because of this, temps are pretty good and the majority of the time sit between 60 and 70 degrees. And when you're not using ray tracing, you're gonna see power draw somewhere in the mid 200s. To actually power this monster, you'll need to use this triple 8-pin power adapter connected to 3 separate PCIe cables from an 850 watt power supply. Nvidia recommends at least 750 watts for the Founders Edition, but Gigabyte says you're gonna need 850 on this one. I think it's always a good idea to give yourself some headroom, one for peace of mind, but two, just to allow upgrades in the future. This 1000 watt Silverstone power supply is way more than I need, but it's one of the only SFX power supplies that can actually properly power the 4080. It costs $300, which is insane. It's great to future-proof and runs nearly silent. But the real reason I bought it was to have 3 separate PCIe cables. This is actually super important because daisy chaining the cables can brick the entire card. I did this with my last power supply and didn't have any issues for about 3 months until one day I was actually trying to record this review and my screen kept going black. I restarted the PC multiple times until I finally opened up the case to find out it was melting on me. I originally thought that it was because I bent my Nvidia adapter just to close my side panel, but it happened again once I R-made the card and got it back literally 5 minutes after turning it on. So I swapped out the power supply and haven't had any problems since. If you're not able to shut your panel on your case or just want to better manage your cables, the cable mod angled adapter is a literal lifesaver. There's 4 versions, so just look at the product descriptions to figure out which one you're going to need for your specific card. Mine does have a slight wobble, but cable mod says this is completely normal, so just check that the adapter itself is fully seated and the cable that you're plugging into it is as well. Specs wise, the 4080 is a beast. Comparing it to the 3080, there's a 12% increase in the number of CUDA cores and a 50% increase comparing their boost clocks. There's an additional 6GB of VRAM totaling up to 16, which is great for 4K gaming, but also heavier apps like Blender. For the rest of my PC specs, I have 32GB of 3200MHz RAM and an i7-9700K. I'm still waiting to upgrade my CPU, so there's going to be a slight bottleneck in the benchmarks, but it's nothing more than like 5 FPS. At times, the GPU's usage does drop quite low, but I've noticed it stays pretty high with ray tracing and DLSS 3 enabled. I tried editing one of my last 2 videos on the rig, and while it was super laggy, switching all of my peripherals from a Mac to the PC was a breeze. Uni Accessories are sponsoring the video today, and I've used their USB hub to have a few more USB-A ports as my motherboard only gives me so many. Typically, you're going to see something like this used with a laptop, but I found it to be super convenient as I need to connect my keyboard, mouse, audio interface, and external SSD in order to properly edit a video. I'm not even sacrificing my USB-C port because it has a pass-through on it. Uni also sells a lot of other accessories that are really nice for creatives like myself who also use a Mac. I've actually found their cables to be really nice though, and great to take advantage of my monitor's high refresh rates. When you're gaming on a card like the 4080, this is something you're definitely going to want. After the video, go and check the description and see what accessories might be a good fit for your setup. I've been an avid ultrawide gamer for over 2 years now, and even after giving a 4K monitor a shot, I still find this to be my favorite way of playing games. Most games these days have native support for the aspect ratio, but you will have some that still letterbox cutscenes, which can totally kill the immersion. On the bright side, the modding community has made a ton of fixes for games that have this. Once you're actually in game with a monitor like this, the immersion is just unmatched. It's not for everyone, but I definitely recommend giving it a try if you can. Now, to look at the real-life gaming performance you can expect to get, I'll be benchmarking 3 different games, all of which support both ray tracing and DLSS 3. With ray tracing disabled, raw performance as expected is going to be pretty good, but I just don't think the jump from last generation is going to be worth the money. Cyberpunk is an obvious first choice as a game to benchmark since it's one of the hardest to run, especially now that the new overdrive ray tracing mode has just been released in the latest update. With just ultra settings, the game jumps around quite a bit in terms of frames, but you can consistently expect it to end up in the low 90s. Temps hover around 64 degrees with power usage in the upper 90s. Turning on DLSS gives a slight boost, keeping frames just under 100 the majority of the time. Utilization did see some drops, but temps were basically the same. The DLSS 2 implementation in Cyberpunk is probably among the better ones, and most of the time looks great visually. The overdrive ray tracing mode in the latest update is actually super impressive. It's fully path traced, which makes for even more realistic shadows and reflections. It is extremely taxing on the system, even more so than regular ray tracing, so the lowest tier card that it even supports is the RTX 4070 Ti. Compared to the Psycho ray tracing mode, it is actually quite a noticeable difference, which I didn't expect, especially when you're in areas with a bunch of puddles and lights. The reflections look super accurate. You basically need frame generation to use this mode though, as the raw performance is only 20 to 25 frames at best. With DLSS 2, you see a boost up into the high 30s, which I still don't consider to be very playable. I fully expected Hogwarts Legacy to flop, not gonna lie, but I've quite enjoyed it the past few weeks I've been playing. Unfortunately, it's now 2 months since launch, and the game is still really buggy for me. I thought that by waiting a little bit after its release, most of the bugs would be ironed out, but I still just get a lot of stutters and graphical issues. It sucks because it kills the immersion from what is otherwise a great game. With ultra settings, the frames vary a ton based on where on the map you are. In a lot of the school where there's not a ton of traffic, it sits comfortably around 70 FPS, but especially in outdoor areas with lots of people, you'll see dips down to the high 50s. Turning on DLSS gives a roughly 10 or 15 FPS boost depending on where you are. Inside, you can sit around 90 frames, and outside you typically hit a solid 60. The utilization is really low in this game, so I do think that unlike the others, it experiences a much more severe CPU bottleneck. Ray tracing this game without any upscaling is pretty unplayable. On average, you're sitting around 40 FPS with drops to the low 30s in crowded areas. Visually, it looks pretty good, but in some areas, they really overdid the reflections where it just feels super unnatural. DLSS makes ray tracing a lot more playable. It typically will sit around 50 frames, but does have peaks up to 70 in quieter areas. The Witcher 3 has been one of the games on my backlog for the longest time, so I was really excited to see that they had this next-gen DLSS 3 update back in December. It was a little buggy at launch, and while there's still some stutters here and there, it's currently in a much better state. With ultra settings, the game got a solid 90 FPS, which for a game like this is perfect. I find this to be the sweet spot for single-player games, because I don't ever feel like I'm panning around enough to really appreciate the smoothness of 120 FPS. The game is a little more demanding in terms of powers and thermals. It almost always draws over 300 watts, and fluctuates from around 64 to 67 degrees. Turning on DLSS gives a nice 10-ish frame boost, so if you want to surpass 100 in most areas, these settings alone will do it for you. Ray tracing without any upscaling runs similar to Hogwarts, averaging 40 FPS in most of the map, but in really dead areas, it can start to hit closer to 50. This is getting to a point where I'd consider it playable, but would still turn on DLSS for a consistent 60. The 4080 is super capable at this ultra-wide resolution, but ray tracing still doesn't run quite well enough with just DLSS that I think it's worth using. Frame generation, on the other hand, has been quite impressive and actually makes ray tracing viable in most games. My understanding of how it works at a super high level is that it takes 2 frames that were rendered by the GPU, and then using AI looks at those and comes up with a fake frame to insert in between. This doesn't necessarily mean your frames are going to double, as in more GPU bound games you will see an increase, just not quite as much from a game that's more CPU bounded. Because the GPU has to wait around to render those 2 frames and then generate another one to place in between, you are going to see an increase in input lag. It is noticeable and will be really noticeable if your base frame rate is pretty low, but when you're in a single player game and not really paying attention to it, I don't think it's much of an issue. It's weird because the game visually looks a lot smoother, but because of the delay, you're still feeling super sluggish and almost like you're at the same exact frame rate as without frame generation. If you're starting from 30 FPS and go to 100, there won't be as much tearing, but your mouse movements are still gonna feel like you're playing in 30 FPS. Taking a look at some benchmarks, Cyberpunk at ultra settings has frames all over the place. In one area during a mission, I was getting a solid 160 frames, completely maxing my monitor, but in the rest of the map, 120 was pretty typical. Going back to the ray tracing overdrive mode, frame generation gets you around 70 to 80 frames, which is super insane that we have full path tracing at such a playable frame rate. The only downside is the input lag is really noticeable given how low the base frame rate is. In Hogwarts Legacy with ultra settings, frame generation sits around 120 to 160 FPS. This is a really nice range as it is going to max out your monitor a lot of the time, but outside there is some sub 100 dips every now and then. With ray tracing, it peaks about 120 FPS, but it typically sits around 80 if you're in crowded or outdoor areas of the map. Enabling frame generation with ultra settings in The Witcher 3 sees a boost up to 130 on average, but in less dense areas it maxes my monitor's refresh rate very easily. With ray tracing, it sits around 90 FPS on average, but in certain parts of the map it does exceed 100. When I finally get to really grinding out this game, these will definitely be the settings I use, as the game looks gorgeous and the lag feels pretty minimal. As I've said, the 4080 is an absolute monster of a card. I don't have a 4K monitor in my home setup, but when I was away for the holidays at my second setup, this thing absolutely killed it. There's no doubt if you want high refresh rate 4K gaming, the 40 series looks pretty damn good. I think the 4080 specifically is perfect for ultrawide gaming, as you don't really need to go all out with the 4090, as this still provides over 100 FPS without ray tracing. For me, coming from a 2070 Super, this was an insane upgrade, and I plan to use this PC for far more than gaming in the future, so I think it was a worthy one. It's a bit of a harder sell to anyone with a 30 series card because the raw performance just isn't enough of an increase to justify the $500 price increase. The O11 is a really nice case to build in, so if you are looking at a 40 series card, it's a great pick. Just make sure you do have the right power supply and the cable mod adapter. I hope this video has been helpful, and if you do have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. Otherwise, I've been Cole, and I appreciate you all for watching. Catch you in the next one, but until then, take care.